My name is Mike Snow, and I want to talk about Trespassers on the Roof of the World, The Secret Exploration of Tibet by Peter Hopkirk. I think I've been interested in Tibet ever since I first saw it on Twin Peaks years ago, and that piqued my interest on the subject. I've been interested in this mysterious, distant country for quite a while now, and its Buddhist religious practices. And this story talks about the period in Tibet's history when it was closed off to Westerners, sort of like the Japanese Sakoku when they were a closed country. It's amazing how many countries back then in the East felt that they wanted to shut themselves away from all Western contact after, sort of like if they dig their head in the sand about something, it's going to go away, and they just want to be left alone. And it's also amazing the arrogance of the Westerners involved, and how they feel entitled to go anywhere against the laws of that country and be treated as if they were in their own country. It really is staggering that they felt they had a right to do that against, trespassing is the right word for this, going against the laws of this people. They really just wanted to be left alone to pursue their lives. Now, Europeans had known a little bit about Tibet for a few hundred years before this, when a few missionaries, Jesuits and so forth, had gone to Tibet here and there. And the Tibetans at the time didn't really care about this and didn't really bother. But in the 1800s, they became deeply suspicious of Westerners and ordered all of them out and closed off their country to any Western encroachment. Pretty much anyone who wasn't a Tibetan was going to be harmed if they were found inside of the country. And they might have been killed, imprisoned, tortured, or expelled, depending on who they were. And crucially, anyone helping, any Tibetan found helping a European get into the country was himself going to be imprisoned, tortured, or killed, and many were. One of the interesting things about this book is the more realistic picture of Tibet that it paints. I think that because of the Dalai Lama, people in the West have this very perfect Zen-like magical view of Tibet that doesn't really reflect reality. Tibet was essentially a medieval country, and it had all the horrible aspects of a medieval country, including brutal punishments, torture, executions, terrible, unjust punishments. It essentially had a medieval army with swords, chainmail, and spears, and bows and arrows, and maybe a few matchlocks here and there. And it really paints a less idyllic version of Tibet. Tibet was a real place with real problems in it, like any medieval-type country would have. And it's interesting to see it put that way, instead of the sort of namby-pamby, hippie-trippy, New Age kind of way that Tibet is seen today. The first people it talks about trying to penetrate Tibet in the 1800s are actually Indians who were working for the British government in India during the 1800s. And these people, who were referred to as pundits, were native agents sent by the British government to spy in Central Asia. And they were in places that are now Turkmenistan and so forth, but they also went to Tibet, and their story was just fascinating because these were amazingly dedicated, brilliant men who went into Tibet from India. They posed as traders or Buddhist holy men, and pretended, and knowing that they would be killed if they were discovered. At any second, they could have been betrayed and murdered if anyone discovered that they were not actually who they claimed they were, and spent time mapping areas of Tibet. They would actually walk along and use a prayer beads to count 100 steps, and then count 100 more, and do this for hundreds of thousands of steps, and count miles and miles and miles, and try to get a measure of distance in a country that there's very little geographical knowledge of at the time. It's absolutely fascinating that they were that dedicated, and really not treated very well by the company afterwards, which is pretty sad. But the book spends most of its time talking about Europeans that tried to get into the country, and the Europeans were a fascinating mixture of amateur archaeologists, wannabe geologists. A lot of them were very eccentric amateurs, though. They were just people that wanted to explore, that were fascinated with this mysterious country, including a Canadian couple that went there with their infant child, which was a huge mistake, because the child died and froze to death along the way. And their stories are extremely interesting because they're true tales of hardship. It's hard to imagine how difficult travel was back then, how hard it was on people to simply get from one place to another, especially in one of the highest places on Earth in the Himalayan mountains, under terrifying conditions that it required truly heroic endurance to get through. And it's actually amazing that quite a few of the people that went were women. There were, including one woman who went alone with one male native servant. She was absolutely amazing that this, I believe it was a French woman, went there. I mean, she was at amazing toughness to survive in these horrendous conditions, cold that we don't know. Even the coldest parts of the United States can never get as cold as what they experienced in one of the highest places on Earth, near Tibet. In the late 19th century, a sort of race began among explorers to reach Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, which almost none of them reached. And that's kind of a sad part about this story, that because it's in the real world and not a part of fiction, you have to realize that not all of them make it. In a fictional story, they would have overcome terrific odds and actually made it, but most people did not actually get there. Some people got within 100 miles of Lhasa, the great holy city of Tibet, but they never actually made it, and they were turned back right at the moment, in this tragic moment that they were forced to go back when they were this close to getting to their goal. One of the people that actually made there was actually Japanese, and I believe a Russian person actually made it there. But it spends most of its time about the Europeans. Towards the end of the book, it talks about a forgotten era of history, and I really am fascinated by this era. It's sort of like the climax, or sort of maybe more of a coda, in a way, to the great game that Russia and the British Empire played in Central Asia in the 19th century. It talks about how the British became paranoid about Russians infiltrating Tibet, and they urgently demanded of the Tibetans an answer about what the Russians were doing there, what the Russians wanted to do, if the Russians were trying to take Tibet over and get a lead on them to attack India. All absurd, of course, because the Russians were never trying to do that, and the Tibetans just didn't feel, rightly, I suppose, that they had no requirement to answer a demand from the British of another sovereign country. They had no right to answer any of their demands, and the British became extremely paranoid. In the early 1900s, Britain actually invaded Tibet and fought a few battles with them and killed a few thousand people and reached Lhasa and, quote, normalized relations with the Tibetans. And it's a fascinating part of the history. However, I do have to say that ultimately I wasn't crazy about this book, and it's not really a fault of the book, because it's more a fault of me, because I really should have questioned whether I was truly interested in this. I ended up not being as excited about these explorers' journeys as I was. It wasn't as fascinating as the ones in Central and the rest of Central Asia. These people just did not seem to lead as interesting a life as the other archaeologists and explorers and subalterns and military men from Russia and the British Empire that penetrated Central Asia. And so many of the stories are so repetitive. You know, they're horrible hardship, terrible struggle, and they never reach their goal. And you have to read that again and again and again, and it gets pretty sad. And there's even a chapter about them trying to climb Mount Everest, which I was totally not interested in and skipped most of it, to be honest. Really, only the part about Lhasa being taken over by the British, which was covered in another one of his books, in his book about the Great Game in general. And really, I don't think I read anything new in this book about that. It was pretty much all covered in the previous book. I think it didn't really answer a lot of the questions I had, because I'm more fundamentally interested in Tibet itself, and I would want to read a book more about Tibetan culture and language and art and religion and just the Tibetan people and their history more than Europeans trying to reach it, which I found was less interesting than I initially thought it would be. And I'm also much more interested in the Chinese takeover of Tibet, maybe because they're still there. It's interesting to read about this point where Britain tried to take over Tibet and so forth, but ultimately it didn't have an enormous impact on Tibetan history like the Red Chinese invading the country, because they're still there and still in a lot of trouble. It's a fascinating book, I suppose, if you like these European explorers, but I don't think it really covered anything that you couldn't find in Peter Hopkirk's other books. This is maybe the only one of his books that I would say maybe to skip. Even if you're fascinated by Tibet, you may want to read more books that are more in-depth about Tibet, which I can't really recommend this one. Overall, I don't think it really held my interest like his other books did. I wanted to read a more Tibet-focused book, not a European explorer-focused book. It's not a bad book, though. I wouldn't say that you would... it's not like I hated reading it. I enjoyed it more or less. It just didn't really capture my interest like the other books did. So I can't really give it a favorable rating like his other books. But ultimately, might want to pass on this one compared to the other ones, unless you're a fanatic for this stuff like I am.